So welcome everyone. In this talk, I want to continue our discussion from yesterday that was focusing on one of what I call the building blocks of meditation. We were on the concentration side, the word samadhi, and spent time focusing on that. So I want to continue the discussion today, and what I have in mind to do is talk about insight. And in a few different ways. I want to begin by offering my take on a few different understandings of what do we even mean when we talk about insight. Then talk about some of the ways that we practice insight meditation as a practice. Some of these you'll be familiar with. Then to bring that back into how does that relate to concentration. How does concentration fit in if you're doing a practice called insight meditation? And also, how then does bring all this back, the insight part, back even to visit if we do a practice called concentration meditation. There was the quality of concentration yesterday, but as a whole branch of meditation. And then finally, which we may get to today, or it may spill over into the talk for tomorrow, about when we get back to the whole basic goal of what we're doing, then we can come back and revisit this liberation. We call it liberation through non-clinging. You may have your own aims and goals. And how do all these pieces fit together in that way? So I hope when it's all said and done, it will feel clear and simple. And one of the things that's important to keep in mind is that no one can do all of these different practices, right? It's a huge range, and nobody should even want to try to do them all. So the important point is we naturally are drawn towards different styles. We try out a few different styles of practice. Maybe we've read about it, or someone just said, this is what you should do. And so we start trying it out and doing it. And then it might work, it might not. We get informed by a different book, a different teacher, or we come to something on our own through the unfolding within ourselves of our own practice. And of this whole wide range, it gives us a lot of different possible approaches, so we can find and knowing that it's all good and powerful and has worked very well for people, all of them have, then we get to find which ones work best for us. And I say this because I mentioned this idea of coming to trust. I like to call it our inner teacher. It's like our inner guidance, our inner wisdom, our inner knowing, not in an ego way, and to be distinguished from when we think we're following our inner knowing, and yet we're actually just following our likes and dislikes, or following our delusion. And it can be like that sometimes, and it will be sometimes, but that's part of coming to know ourselves. So it's okay. And we might suffer some when that happens, yes, but we learn. Even you choosing to listen to one teacher telling you this is what you have to do and giving yourself over to that teacher, you're actually making your own choice to do that. You're already following your own decision-making process and your own inner guidance, even though we think someone else is giving the guidance. That's it may not be a conscious choice, right? So we're always actually, for better or worse, we're always back onto our own best judgment, discernment, best choices of what is the best way forward. All right. And and again, as we learn to trust that, I think the way gets clearer as we get the feedback of what works and doesn't, if we can hold ourselves with kindness and not judgment. So the word that we translate as insight in Pali, it's Vipassana with a V. You'll sometimes hear it pronounced with a W sound, Vipassana. That's a Burmese accent on the Pali pronunciation. The V sound is what they call International Standard Pali. It's not like one's right or wrong. We actually don't know the exact pronunciations in the old days, in the ancient days. So all the different pronunciations are fine. I'm just mentioning that so you know there's different dialects, different accents is all it is. But most of the time it is spelled with a V, and you'll hear it pronounced with a V, Vipassana. And we translate it as insight. Well, the word, if you tease it apart, the pasana comes from this word pasati. You don't have to know Pali, but sometimes I throw a little in. If you're not interested, don't worry about it. The pasati, to see. And the vi has the meaning of, it's like if you wanted to tease apart. So it's sort of like if the image that's used, if there's weeds growing and you can't see the ground and you want to see to the ground, you would put your hands in the weeds and pull them apart to see down to the ground. So it's like a opening or pulling apart in that way, and then the pasati, to see. So sometimes it's translated as to see clearly. We translate as insight. So I'll offer you my own take on insight. There may be people who offer different takes on it. My take on insight is anything that we come to see or know or experience or understand in service of liberating or freeing ourselves from our suffering. Anything like that, that understanding like that, I would call it insight. Now, traditionally, and this is what you'll hear a lot, insights are thought of as having insight into what's called the three characteristics of all experience, or the three characteristics of all existence. It's kind of a weighty sounding phrase. But so let me just pause on it. I don't want to spend too much time, and you can look this up yourself if you want to spend more, but it's a big deal. And you'll hear it talked about a lot, the three characteristics. And I'll just mention the Pali again because you'll hear it, but don't try to remember it. In Pali, it's anicca, dukkha, anatta. The anicca is impermanence. Dukkha gets translated as suffering. It's not the best translation, but we're kind of stuck with it. And anicca, dukkha, anatta, which is also a very poor translation, is no self, not self, or no self. So let me just say a little about these three characteristics and then why having insights into them. We'll talk about how we can practice to have these insights and why we would want to have these insights. What's the point? Let me just say what they are. So the first one, impermanence. Well, you'll get many, many, many Dharma talks on impermanence. And if you remember the other day, I think it was yesterday, I quoted Goenka, and he had this lovely quote that began with saying, real understanding is seeing that, or real wisdom is understanding that all things are impermanent. So he's going right to the insight or the understanding of this particular characteristics. And so I'll just put it this way. We all know intellectually that nothing lasts. By the way, this impermanence sometimes in modern times has been more reframed as things are in constant change. That's not the traditional understanding. It was more about the things don't last, but it works perfectly fine also when people talk about it as things are constantly changing. I think you get the same effect to help liberate us from clinging, because the idea is, if we really got it, like not just as an idea, but as a lived moment-to-moment experience, that things don't last. We see the second characteristic of this word dukkha, which I'm going to say a little more in just a moment, of suffering. When we cling to things, right? If you're clinging to your youth, well, it's too late for me to do that. But I will tell you, I'm 68 years old now, and there are times, I notice I look in the mirror, and I think, who is that old guy looking back at me in the mirror? What happened? What went wrong? Where did my youth go? Right? It can feel like that, right? Until you realize that nothing went wrong. I can tell you exactly. I'm talking to the old guy in the mirror. I can tell you exactly what happened. This is what happens. And for all these years of giving Dharma talks on impermanence, I've given many of them. Well, that wasn't for me. That's for all of you. oh, wait, this is going to happen to me. It did happen to me. Some of you have a few years on me, so I'm not going to get any sympathy from you. But for those of you who are younger, let me just tell you, we can go, yeah, you're going to get older, but no, for real. I remember in my youth, I'm starting to get into a little talk on impermanence, but I won't do too much. I'll stick with the insight side. But when I was an active rock climber for many years, I was a decent climber in my day. I'd done multi-day climbs up in Yosemite and stuff. I was a pretty good climber. Not, they're not doing YouTube videos on me, but I was a good climber. And I remember I was in my early 30s, and we were looking up. We were getting ready to do a climb, and we were waiting for some people who were already on it to get up ahead of us a little, just a day climb. And a friend of mine said, "You notice you don't see any older people out here." And I said, "That's not going to be me. I'm going to keep it up." I had no clue of what's going to happen as the body gets older and slows down. No clue. And I eat organic vegetables, and I exercise, and I don't smoke, and I meditate, stress reduction. And guess what? And I actually lift weights. I'm in pretty good shape for my age. And you know what? The body is way slowed down. It's just what happens. So if I'm clinging to my youth, it's not a wise path to happiness, and it's a setup for suffering. That's the idea, right? So I could go on and on about the reason you hear so many talks about impermanence, this characteristic, is that when we hear things like this, we all go, oh, yeah, but we don't live our lives as if it's true. And we suffer when, it's a funny thing, because when things are not going our way, and you're either not getting what you want or you're getting what you don't want, we can't wait. We love impermanence because we can't wait for it to change. And the flip side of it was when everything's going along great, we hate impermanence. How did we get in this human condition, this situation? But here we all are. So this is the idea, to come really to get it on a more, to actualize it as a part of our being, just to know that we're more in harmony with the way life is, and we're not in a battle with nature. Right? As long as I don't think I'm supposed to have a young face looking back to me in the mirror, then it's okay. And I don't have to go borrow my wife's glasses and put them on, or take mine off so everything looks blurry. When I do this, I take the glasses off. It's like, well, there I am. I don't see it, same as I've always been. No problem. Put these back on where I can see clearly. It's like, oh, it's not that way. So anyway, you get the idea. I could do we could spend the whole retreat just exploring impermanence. It's important. So if we have the ideas, the insights we can have, which is to deepen the lived kind of connection with it, but not in a way to freak us out or scare us, but so that we really can come to a sense of ease and peace. So we're more flowing in harmony with the unfolding of life. That's kind of the idea of having the insights. Okay. We'll come in a few minutes to how you can practice. Sometimes you just hear talks like this and you reflect in your mind. You're already doing an insight kind of practice. The second characteristic, which is translated as dukkha, is suffering. And I've already talked about it. It's the suffering that comes through clinging. But as a characteristic of all experience, if you looked at the etymology of the word, it has the meaning of a cart, the axle of the wheel of a cart that's out of balance, out of round. And when a cart's out of the wheels out, it just means you get a bumpy ride. And so to really get to the meaning of dukkha, it's not just suffering. It certainly comprises suffering, but also has the meaning of unreliable or unsatisfactory. And what it means is that unreliable just means that, in case you haven't noticed, that regardless of your best intentions and your best efforts, sometimes you'll get what you want and sometimes you won't. And as I said earlier, sometimes you'll get what you don't want. right? So we have a certain degree, I guess you could say, of control. That's kind of a philosophical debate. Do we have any real control? But I'm not going there. Let's just say life's not completely in our control. And um, so it's kind of there's an unreliable nature to it. Things can change, right, at any time. And so when we say it's unsatisfactory, um, an example I often use is I like dark chocolate, good dark chocolate. Don't go buy those Trader Joe's 1 pound dark chocolates. It's just not worth it eating that, right? It's not so good. It's inexpensive, but a good quality dark chocolate, when I'm eating that, I'm not suffering. But fortunately, I don't expect that piece of chocolate to give me more than it's capable of giving. I have the pleasure in the moment. It passes, it goes. And the next day, I'm right back where I was. I still want another piece. And the day after that, I'm going to want another piece. It can temporarily give us some happiness. There's no question. We don't want to deny that, right? When pleasant experiences come, it does feel good. We don't have to call that suffering. It's not suffering. But if we just let it go, you can walk, somebody once said to me, well, if I'm on retreat and they said, I'm doing walking practice and I come up and I see a beautiful flower and I'm drawn to it. Isn't that sensual desire? And then I smell it and I love the smell. Isn't that desire? Sure it is. But if it doesn't rise to the point of craving and clinging, it's no big deal. You enjoy it, it's desire, and you let it go and you move on. This is getting more into the Four Noble Truths about craving as the cause of clinging. This is the insights we can have when we talk about suffering, right? And I'll say more about that in just a minute. So it's our suffering that comes from clinging, and part of that is because things are impermanent, and our inability to just bring a sense of equanimity and peace with all the ups and downs in life. A big shift in my own practice happened when, I think this happened I was on a pretty long retreat. I'd been several months into this thing and I was pretty deep in. And I remember I used to I meditate in my room, but if I ever got lonely, I'd go out and do my walking practice out in the dining hall when nobody was in there. Somehow I don't know, I just like to do it better. And I remember being in there walking and it was a real insight when I realized, and all this stuff is going through my mind. I still had all this samadhi in it, but you have ups and downs, even in the deep retreat context. And I realized that I was more interested in how I was relating to whatever was happening rather than my bliss or whatever experience I wanted. And it was more that the sense of allowing things to come and go and rather than clinging to them. And the relief that is, even when the unpleasant comes, but we have the insight into the impermanence, we see it, we experience it, and we know, yes, this is the experience now. It's coloring our perception, but it's also a conditioned state, and it's going to come and go. There's no experience any of us have ever had. It can feel like it. I want to be very respectful here. If you're dealing with chronic pain and it feels like it's never going away, that's serious for sure. But mostly the experiences we have, they come and go. Our happiness, our joy, our ups and downs. Right? We learn then about the insight into suffering. This aspect of dukkha is because through experience, we can do some set practices, but we can also just have the experience of sitting quietly and try to be present with ourselves. And it can be a real insight practice as we're just getting to see how hard it can be to let ourselves be. And we hang out with that and we get to see the first noble truth. This is suffering. The second noble truth, this was its cause. The third noble truth, that there could be an end. And the fourth was the way, how we were able to find the way. That's the Four Noble Truths as an insight practice. So there's impermanence, there's dukkha, we'll call it suffering for now, good enough. The third characteristic, which is translated as no self or not self or non-self, we're stuck with that term, and people say you don't have a self. That's not the teaching. You do, I'm going to say it right here, and this is going up on YouTube, so it's going to live forever on the internet. You do have a self. Of course you have a self. In the old, let me explain. Back in the, in ancient India, there are these scriptural texts called the Upanishads. A lot of the yogic traditions come out of there. And in the Upanishads, there's this idea of what they call Brahman. And Brahman is, it's like God. It would be the similar. It's like the ultimate ground of existence itself. And it's considered to be the eternal essence of existence, if you will. And it's considered to have three you don't have to remember this, but just to hear it, it has three characteristics, which is called Sat, Chit, Ananda. Sat, existence; Chit, consciousness; and Ananda, bliss. It's pure existence itself, consciousness itself, and bliss itself. And it's considered to be eternal and unchanging. That's Brahman. And then you, according to these texts, have your Atman, which is your eternal soul. And the idea of the soul is when you really see that the soul is like one with, that's this whole thing about, they say you're one with God. It's kind of like that kind of thing. You see that your soul is also eternal. It's called the Atman. The Sanskrit is Atman. The Pali is Atta, and you put an A in front, Anatta. It doesn't mean no self. It means no Atman, no permanent eternal soul. Doesn't mean you don't have a self. So, right? And it shouldn't even be taken as an ontological truth statement about whether you actually have an eternal soul or not. It's that everything you can know and see and feel and touch and be aware of, it's all impermanent and changing and should not be clung to as self. That's the teaching of anatta. Not that you don't have a self, it's all saying that it's all changing. Everything you can know is changing. You have a self, but you're not a noun, you're a verb. The nature of yourself is a collection of changing processes. And there's no permanent eternal Richard in here to whom all this is happening. Then yes, I have a self, but the nature of this self is a changing process. We could say more, but I'm going to leave it at that for now. If that's evocative, I'm happy to chat with you offline, or you can find so many talks and books and commentaries on this topic. It's huge. It's all going back to impermanence and not clinging to anything. That's the point. It's not to make a truth statement of whether you have a soul or not. It doesn't matter. It's letting go, liberation through not clinging to any of this, because it's an all changing process. I know that was quick. I'm going to slow back down, but I just wanted to get that in there on the three characteristics. So traditionally, you can do some practices, as I will name in a few moments, that are looking to see or have insight into one or more of these characteristics, so that the kind of sense that I'm pointing to as I've been talking becomes more alive in us. You really get it, not as intellectual, but and then the idea is if we can really get it, ostensibly, it helps liberate us from clinging. That's the idea about having those insights, why it's supposed to be helpful for us. So I'll just leave that at that for now about those traditional insights, but also you can have, I just want to add in, you can have psychological insights in service of Dharma liberation. Psychological insights, psychological healings aren't necessarily liberation practices, but if held in the context of Dharma, they can be. And probably for so many of us, we come to know ourselves and the patterns, the psychological, mental patterns that create suffering. So a perfect example would be, this is one of the things I dealt with for many years when I was young, was self-esteem issues, which could take many forms. I won't get into it. I had my own flavor of it, and it was quite powerful. And I had a lot of suffering around it. It's not so operative. I don't really, actually, it was a lot of years later, I realized, wow, that's right. I used to it was like a dominant feature of my whole being was my self-esteem. And what happened? Don't even think about it anymore. I feel like a little psychotherapy didn't hurt, but I think a lot of the meditation and Dharma practice really I attributed a lot to that too. I'm not claiming I don't have any psychological issues. we're all human beings, but it's really kind of amazing what can heal up with these practices. Well, if you have what we would call in the Western psychological way of thinking, poor self-esteem, that's actually a very strong clinging and identity, fixed identity. Remember we saying your whole being is changing, and when we cling to any fixed identity, it's a setup for suffering. Poor self-esteem happens to be a strong identity of a fixed identity, happens to be a suffering generating version of an identity. And so when you heal up, have insight, and you start to realize what's going on, maybe where did that come from? You maybe do psychotherapy, maybe it comes through Dharma practice. Other ways, we start to have insights into ourselves in our process. This is maybe a healing happens, and those patterns that are generating clinging and suffering start to disentangle and heal up. And by the way, I should add, when you get then what's called a healthy sense of self, isn't that what, are we not supposed to have a sense of self like that? Well, you can use that language, but another way of saying it, if you want to use the non-self kind of language, is if we heal up the disentangle from the unhealthy sense of self, we don't have to create this new thing, new identity to take its place. We can just look to see what is this, what if it's like, what am I like if I'm not clinging to some negative identity, right? So anyway, I just don't have time to explore that more. I'm just trying to make the point that psychological insights are valid insights. They're not in the tradition, but all these other insights can, sometimes people will sit to meditate, and I don't know if you call this a psychological insight, but many times I've had people come to me and they say, wow, I'm trying to sit and just be with my breath. I can't stop controlling the breath. This is interesting. Let me hang out with this. What's this about? So they're starting to do some investigation, some insight practice. Okay, let me see if I can relax my belly. Okay, it's relaxed. Wow, it's tense again. I think I can't stop controlling. I didn't realize it, but I think I'm kind of go around with sort of this unacknowledged kind of subtle controlling that permeates all my life. All of a sudden they have more, one thing, it doesn't have, I'm just making up just to make a point. It can open up into all ways of being. Well, where did that come from? What's going on? Maybe they have memories from their childhood or whatever can happen. And maybe you can start to disentangle that a little bit through these processes, because the insight came, it shined the light of awareness, and then ways that we were clinging and creating reactive stances in relationship to things start to dissolve, and we're more in a flow of equanimity. So these are just a few things. I could say many, many more, but my point is so many forms that insights into the world around us and into ourselves can come. Okay, so for me, I have a very broad view about what anything that helps liberate us from suffering. Anything that helps liberate us from suffering, to me, is a valid insight. So that's kind of a quick on like what are insights. Well, there's a range of ways you can actually do practices. We're setting the concentration piece aside now, that you can do practices called Vipassana meditation or insight meditation. And I'll just name a few. It's a big world. One very common, there's a structure, one of the discourses of the old text that many of you know. Some of you won't know this, who've told me you're pretty new to all this. It's called the Four Foundations of Mindfulness, and it's a particular structure. So you can look it up on your own. I'm not going to go through the list. It's a big topic, but it's worth hanging out and coming to read about a little. You don't have to necessarily memorize it all. And it's a system that breaks down many different ways to be mindful of the body. There's like 6 different practices of body awareness that are given. And some of those there's one of them is mindfulness of breathing that we've been doing, and it breaks it down into some steps. So it's a particular system or structure. You don't have to use it, but it is one. There's paying attention to what's going on in the mind. There's paying attention to what's going on, what they call Vedana with the V, feeling tone, that there's a pleasant, unpleasant, or kind of neither, we call it neutral, it's not neutral. In between, it's not pleasant or unpleasant, quality that is that's associated with every experience. So we can pick one or more of these qualities and particularly be mindful of them. You could just take the body and bring your mindful awareness to connect with the body, and that would be considered insight practice. The idea being that if you just stay connected with the body, you will come to, first of all, it's going to have to help you steady your mind, so some concentration will come, but just through the bare mindfulness alone, we'll start to see the rising and passing away and the changing. We'll come to see the suffering that comes through clinging. Just so many insights can come just by bringing mindfulness to the body. That's, we call it, it could be an insight practice. We're connecting with the process of change and how we relate to change. You could connect with what's going on in your mind. You could, in the same way, you could purposely notice that certain experiences are pleasant or unpleasant or kind of in between. We call it neutral. And you can sort of just be aware of, highlight that experience, that aspect of experience itself, and just start to notice the changing is pleasant, unpleasant, come and go, and how it affects whether we're clinging or not. I realize this is kind of just a quick, 35,000 foot view on all of these. And we could easily really slow this down and go through the whole four foundations. And it's not just one way that particular model is practiced, right? Sometimes people, I'll come back actually and name a few different varieties in a moment. There's other parts that I'm not naming in that particular structure. But I'm just saying that's one thing that's out there that you can investigate, and you'll hear on retreats. I just want you to know this when you hear people talking about, if you hear the term in Pali, it's a long tongue twister name, so you don't have to remember it, but it's Satipatthana. We translate that as foundations of mindfulness, which is good enough translation. So that's a model, a system that's used for how to bring your mindfulness to connect with things. Other times you may not use that model. There are practices that just instruct us to, when you sit in meditation, putting your attention in, it's taught in various ways, but you end up placing your attention on various experiences, and you're particularly looking on purpose to notice the fact of change. So you're actively looking for the impermanence that way, right? You're paying attention to that aspect on purpose. That's a kind of practice. Even with your breathing, right? I didn't say on the instructions here, notice the change. Matter of fact, I'm specifically not asking people to do that. It's different. But that would be a powerful insight practice just with the breath, and notice it's changing. It starts, it builds, it comes in, it goes out. The belly, it starts, it rises, it falls, whatever. If I want to, I can actually notice the fact of change in many forms. That would be an insight practice. Or I can just spend time on the second foundation, on the second characteristics, and use the structure of the Four Noble Truths. And I could purposely look for, is the mind at quantumness and at ease, or is there some kind of suffering? And when there's suffering, I really look to see, is there clinging there? Is there craving there leading to the clinging? Is there a way to let go? I'm purposely doing an insight kind of practice to look into that, right? There are other models out there. There's a model, again, I'm just touching on these because I want you to have heard them, because you'll hear them in other retreats and when people teach, what's called the Five Aggregates. Don't try to memorize all these lists. Just let me know later and I can give you the lists. But the Five Aggregates is a way of deconstructing yourself, your being, into five parts. There's the body, and then they take the mental aspect into five different, like there's the whole thinking process, there's consciousness itself, there's that Vedana, pleasantness, unpleasantness. It's a whole list. And using that model, I'm not, again, because of time, I'm not trying to give you the list, but it's a way to deconstruct yourself. And then you actually notice your experience through the lens of this five aggregates model. And you start to see that there's these different aspects of my being, different arisings and passings away of all of this. And it's none of it's permanent. And it's a way to have insights into the impermanent nature of your being. Okay. There's other models. One's called the sixth sense basis, or you could call it the six senses. And we just notice that you pick any of the senses: visual, seeing, it's all changing, coming and going; hearing, coming and going; smelling, tasting, body sensations, thoughts. So there's many ways we can consciously put our attention to purposely doing what we call insight practices, but it all really comes down to staying connected with some kind of changing experiences. One thing I'll also mention, because it was either like, I think it was yesterday or the day before, someone brought up this thing of Vipassana, named a teacher called Mahasi Sayadaw and U Pandita. And so that's a style that's still around. So that's a style that's, in those cases, they may not necessarily direct your attention to, it's a number of different ways, but not direct your attention onto this experience or that, but you just stay with whatever arises. You don't give the breath maybe any preference at all, but it's just whatever arises moment to moment that's predominant in your awareness, and you just put your bare mindfulness on it. And by doing that, we just, again, see it's all arising and passing away, and we learn to let go around it. So it's just a style of practice, right? The point is, when we talk about Vipassana meditation, there's a lot of different methods and practices, but they all kind of share more or less this idea in common of coming to know these changing experiences, how we suffer when we cling. And so different skillful means to help us sort of break that process, right? And depending on how they direct us to put our attention. When these insight practices are taught, depending on the teacher, there's a wide range of how teachers will emphasize to bring the concentration part in. So if you were to do a typical retreat, say at a place like IMS in Barre, Massachusetts, I'll just use that because maybe some of you might know it's that particular center, but other kind of centers in that tradition, meditation is not only taught one way there, but what I'm about to say is kind of a common way it used to be back in the days when I was around there more. I haven't been there for a long time, so I don't know. It may have changed. And the idea was you'd come in, and for the first few days, the emphasis would be, as we're doing here, staying just with the breath. And the idea is to build some concentration up for the steadiness. And then after a few days, they add instructions in to bring your attention to open up, to allow all these other experiences to come in. And even when you opened up to other experiences, there is how should I say it? Some teachers would still give some certain amount of emphasis to staying with the breath as a steadying foundation for concentration, but still opening, you still want to stay connected with change and being open to other experiences that would come in. And other teachers would tend to let go of any kind of anchor like the breath completely and just be open moment to moment by changing experiences. Yeah. By the way, choiceless awareness is another one that people they have this idea of resting back in awareness rather than directing your attention onto objects, but sort of receiving back. That's another kind of practice that some people don't relate to it, but is very powerful for other people. So if you're doing a kind of meditation called insight meditation, regardless of the many, many ways you can do it, and I just was trying to touch on to get a feel or a sense, just because of time, can't go into a lot of detail here. There's also a big range for any of those styles on how much emphasis on the concentration side you would get. Whether you purposely concentrate enough concentration, a certain amount of concentration, or if you're not putting your attention on the breath at all as say as a foundation. The idea is just by staying moment to moment with changing experiences, you're still paying attention and having to direct your attention. And so it does cultivate some samadhi, and you get enough to stay present. Yeah. Now, so that's a little bit on the insight side. Now you can see that if you go back to what we talked about yesterday, I was talking about two main ways that undistractedness can unfold. One is you could become so undistracted on sort of the one thing or one pointed, you actually lose connection with changing flow of experiences. And the other way was more of a inclusive samadhi, where the mind comes just as steady and present and clear, but it doesn't, but all these experiences within that can arise and pass away. If you think that the way to liberation is through having insights into change, I'm going to say more about that in a minute, because I don't think that is the only pathway. It's one of the pathways for sure. But if you think that's the pathway, and that's what you teach and practice, is to having these insights into impermanence, and if you believe that getting concentration leads you to that kind of samadhi where you have shut off from change, then you can see why teachers may say, if you're doing concentration practice, you're not doing insight practice. It's for that exact reason, because that's a certain model people have of how samadhi can unfold, that it's disconnected you from change, and you need to be stay connected with change in order to do these kind of insight practices that are, right, they can feel impermanence and the suffering of, you need to have changing experiences. That's the reason people separate out concentration and insight. That's a particular style of practice. It's a great, none of these are right or wrong. It's all good, but that's a particular approach. I would say two things about that. Number one, two things. One is that, well, that's not the only way samadhi unfolds. And in fact, for most people, the more concentrated you are, the more you're not disconnected. Most people, the vast majority, naturally become more connected. And for those of you who have done enough practice at home on retreat, some of you are newer and you're waiting for this to come, and it will. But for many of you who are longtime practitioners, you know what happens when you get more concentrated. And so just ask yourself the question. I already know the answer. Isn't it true that when you've settled more deeply, you're more aware than ever of what's going on? Even you may choose to go look, even within the concentration side, there's times we choose to lean on the insight flavor of practice and look for impermanence, be mindful of changing experiences. But even if you don't, which is great, and you want to have that in your toolkit for sure, but even the times when you're just on this, feels like you're emphasizing more on the samadhi side, when you're concentrated, if something goes on in your body, you know it. Moods, reactivity, suffering goes on in your mind, you know it clearly, because it's the samadhi has enhanced your mindful knowing and your awareness. And so I just don't buy it that, and I'm talking from my own experience and having worked for many people. I can't say for everyone. There may be people that samadhi, you have to be careful, but mostly you don't have to worry about it. The more samadhi you get, the better, because you're that much more undistracted and connected with things. But even if people think that what I just said is true, people just sometimes just choose to do these other kind of practices. They're just drawn to the non-emphasis on the samadhi and really emphasizing the as a conscious technique or practice, these insight flavored kind of approaches, right? And that's just that style of practice. So it's not like one or, you'll feel where you're most drawn, but I do think it's an artificial dichotomy to say, oh, if you're doing concentration, well, you're not doing insight. Okay, this is an insight retreat, so we're not really doing concentration practices. You can practice. I keep saying over and over, of course you can, and we know that. And it's totally fine to do that. That's a respected path of practice. But it's not inherently true. It's just a choice point people are making. So if you're drawn to the samadhi side also, you can see for yourself if what I'm saying is true or not. Find what works for you, right? Just as it's not automatically true that someone separates concentration and insight, and you can look for yourself to see, just because they say it doesn't mean it's true. Just because I say they're not separated doesn't make it true either. You have to look and see how it is for you, right? So that's one thing that regardless of how you generate the samadhi, I don't think it's disconnecting. I think it's connecting. But the way I teach is I want to consciously steer people towards the open, inclusive, connecting samadhi. Even if you go all the way to these states of jhana, there are two different jhana systems out there, actually, it turns out. There's that one pointed, disconnected kind of jhana, and there's a profoundly inclusive, connected kind of jhana. They're different. Eventually they kind of curve around and hit at the same place, but that's getting a little beyond the discussion here. They're not really. But I want to say this, even if you go to get so absorbed in samadhi that you don't feel changing experience, there's actually a lot of insight that happens there. The traditionalists don't think so because they say, oh, you've lost connection with change. It's just subtler. There's not much going on there, but you don't need much going on because the perception's so keenly attuned. That's a different subject. So I don't think, this is just me personally, other people will disagree. I don't think it's possible to practice samadhi in a way that doesn't support insight. That's number one. Number two, we've already been talking about, and you can see for yourself that if you support, even if you want to do concentration practice, you will, but there can be plenty of time when the practice kicks you over to the insight side, right? We've been saying all the times when you can't concentrate and you're beating yourself up and the practice is not going the way you want, or life's not going the way you want, and you're suffering, judging yourself, beating yourself up. You're on the insight side of the practice anyway. So you can't get away from it. We all end up there as part of the practice anyway, right? And so a couple of more things. I would like to offer, again, this is just me, other teachers may disagree, that there's actually a variety of ways that lead to this liberation. Now, I don't claim, I make no claims to have reached the end of the path. So, I'm still practitioner on this path. But I do feel that I've been pleased with, as many of you, I'm sure, feel too, as the Dharma becomes more alive and carries through naturally as part of our lived experience throughout our day. And to the extent I can see, this liberation comes not just one way, just like the practices that work for us are not just one way. The way that we liberate through non-clinging is not just one way. For some people, it has an insight feeling to it. And what I mean is, in the traditional ways I've been speaking, through having those kind of insights, we can feel the letting go happen. And we're more resting in the stream of equanimity, or I call it the stream of non-clinging. Sometimes people don't relate to that phrase, but to me, it has a lot of meaning. It's a lived, those of you who know, it's like the lived Dharma is like flowing, right? And you're just kind of carried in that stream. That can come through all these insights. But another way it happens for many people, and I'm sure they have to do all the insight work too, but it actually feels like through the samadhi, they just kind of come into more of an equanimity and a balance. And they may not consciously be aware that it came because they had any particular insight, but it's just a fruit of really just the balance of the mind there. And you end up in the same non-reactive, open, receptive, harmonious flow with life in the same way. The equanimity comes very alive. So it can come that way. And then another way it can come is something I said called part of the samadhi side, it's what I call the purification of mind, where, well, this actually happens on the samadhi and the insight side. Sitting with your suffering can feel like being in a cauldron. It's a fire, a purification. And we learn, it's not that you have to go looking for suffering. There is a respected path of practice that goes looking for suffering to bring up to work with. I didn't mention that, but that is in the tradition that you can find it for sure. And if you want some examples, go to Jack Kornfield's first book that came out in the early 70s, mid 70s. When the original one was called Living Buddhist Masters. It's been republished. I think most of them aren't living anymore. Maybe none of them are. They've republished it as Living Dharma. And it's interviews with and biographies of 12 great Thai and Burmese men and women. And and what their practice methods were. And some of them were, you would do things, like sit in these positions for a long time, purposely to bring up pain. So then you had something to work with, to let go of. So that's a respected path of practice. I would suggest, though, that you don't have to go looking for suffering. It will find you, in case you haven't noticed. It'll find all of us. So I offer a style of practice that's been a little different. This is kind of getting back to the way I offer it, is because I said this on the opening night, that when, Jeannie was very kind in introducing me, and I'm known as a concentration teacher, and it's true. I have that, people who know me. I don't know if I'm not that well known anymore because I'm kind of the older generation, but that's kind of how I'm known. But it really is a mistake, because to me, all of these qualities have to come together. Mindfulness, samadhi, insight, qualities of the heart too, all of that, they work together. And yes, sometimes it feels like we're leaning on one side or the other, or one has become more prominent, but I think they're all a big deal and all important. And we find our own combination of them for each of us, right? How much we want to emphasize the concentration or not. But certainly some degree of undistractedness, I think, is important. At the very least, some degree on the insight side is important. The mindfulness side, the kind heart. So I think I don't see that I'm overemphasizing the concentration, but I just certainly want to bring it up at least equal with all these other qualities that get talked about, right? So many meditation centers are called like the Insight Center of like IMS, Insight Meditation Center. There's one, Santa Cruz here in California, near where I live, Santa Cruz Insight. We purposely didn't call our center, we didn't call it an Insight Center. Nothing wrong with that, but insight meditation has a particular connotation in our scene, which is, oh, you're not doing concentration practice. So we thought Metta Dharma was a lovely sentiment, and that's why we picked it. And it doesn't pick sides in the meditation practice. So we just did that. I'm not against people using the term insight. It's a great phrase, and I'm a big supporter. If you just do what we're doing here, and you may be drawn to this style, I don't know, but this is what I'm offering, is that you can actually put a huge emphasis. Don't create suffering, be relaxed, don't strive, but just practice in ways that enhance the samadhi and take that as far as you want. I'm only able to give instructions to a certain point on this shorter retreat, but there's a lot more we can say about as it unfolds and how to work. And as I've been saying then, we'll not only steer it, so when you even get into the deeper states, it's the connecting, inclusive style of samadhi, so you get the insights right there, even when you're in the samadhi. But we also are very happy may not always think you're happy, but we learn to be actually welcoming when we find ourselves on the insight side. And then we open to that, and we're all those tools and techniques, just pure insight meditation practices, we're there, and we know how to do all of those. And when it settles out on its own, we come back and we get to flow between them, and they all get to inform each other. And I consider it uh, getting the best of both worlds. Really, that's just how it feels to me. And so that's the way I'm offering in that way. Um, and then again, you'll find your own way of emphasizing it. It is an interesting, as I just said that, I was trying to be a little humorous, but to say, we can be happy to find ourselves on the insight side, but actually there can be some truth there. You should just check this out. You don't actually have to get happy about it. You can kind of fake it. It's okay. But you can just, it can be a lighter touch. Here's how you can fake yourself out and make it work. You're getting all this great samadhi, let's say. I know for those of you who aren't, don't worry, come talk to me about it. It's all workable. But for those of you, maybe you're getting your good samadhi, feels great, and then you lose it all, and then you remember, oh, this is what Shankman's talking about. I'm on the insight side. Just remember that the concentration is going to come back. You're going to get all that stuff you want. You haven't lost anything. So that can help your mind feel like, okay, wait a minute, this is what they're talking about. Let me come to know what's up with suffering and how I can work with this. It's like riding a bicycle. Think about it. If any of you are into biking, I'm a bicycle rider, mountain biker, and often people want to have the fun, beautiful, exhilarating downhill, but you have to ride uphill to get that. And actually, when you think about what builds your muscles up, what really builds you, it's not, the downhill has its benefits too, just the good feeling of it, but you get so much benefit on riding that uphill, even though it can hurt sometimes. And learning to be with our suffering, we say we want to come to understand our suffering and the cause. How is it that we come to understand something? It's through experience, right? So you don't have to go looking, oh, I need to get some experience suffering. Again, I was trying to be a little funny. I guess it wasn't that funny, but nobody laughed. But it's actually literally true. Suffering will find us. And since we know ahead of time that's going to happen, then we don't have to worry when we're not. And it's not just on the meditation cushion, it's in life, right? And it's not to diminish the real pain and suffering when difficulties come mentally, when we have loss, conflict, physical challenges, any of that stuff. I'm not diminishing it in any way. It's hard for sure. And it's real, and we need a lot of compassion and empathy and all of that. I'm not trying to be glib about it, but it's the same in life. So we don't pick the biggest thing if we have a choice. Sometimes we don't have a choice, but maybe we start with the little things. And we look, and a friend of mine once said he considered meditation, part of it was sitting just to learn to be with ourselves, was like learning how to lift little weights. So when the time in life came to lift the inevitable big weights of life, we've had a little practice building up those muscles. So you can hold it like that when things that come we don't like, but that are still workable. We can see the opportunity in that, right? And you don't even have to hold it as an opportunity. I'll just end by sharing about my own practices, super short. I still meditate regularly, and actually my meditation, maybe in some ways more than ever after all these years. And I don't know what would happen if I stopped meditating. I haven't done the experiment. I just don't know. But so everything that happens in the formal practice, I do my practice. The rest of the day, I just live. I'm not saying for you to do this. I'm just sharing for myself. This may not be for you. And it's really two things. I'm not claiming that I can never space out or never, ever be reactive to anything, but, we're all human beings. But that wakeful presence, as we all know who are meditators, carries through a lot. And knowing what's happening moment to moment becomes more of our set point. And getting lost in is a switch, right? Normally for people, being lost on automatic pilot is more of the set point, and then they'll have moments of mindful knowing, and it switches around at some point where the set point is more the wakeful presence and the mindful presence, if you will. And yes, we can have times where we fall off our foundational set point and get reactive and everything. So more and more, through the day what's happening when it happens. And so for me, my practice has actually gotten quite simple. When my heart is open, not closed off, and I'm in the stream of non-clinging, I don't do anything. I just live.
Okay.
And during the times when I'm in reactivity, I'm fallen into clinging or my heart closes off, then that. And then it's a simple practice of open the heart, let go, open the heart, let go. And it's just gotten very, very simple in that way. And in that way, I won't say that I always welcome difficulties in, and I'll be honest with you, there possibly could be perhaps a few times that I complain here and there about life. It's been known to happen. Maybe I shouldn't laugh. But I will say that more of the time, when difficulties come, I actually do see it as an opportunity, in the sense that um, if I want to, when people or situations come that are challenging for me, I'm if there's places where my heart has the potential to close off, I'd rather see it than not. If I care about my own suffering and the suffering of others, then I want to know. And so I can see that as actually, it's kind of a corny cliche to say, oh, I'm getting the gift of, but it can really be that way sometimes. It doesn't feel like a gift always. And the same thing when I fall into clinging. And that's a real nice thing, when instead of just being a good idea, we can actually start really seeing that the teacher that life can be, if we want to hold it that way, in service of the open heart and non-clinging. So that's a way to hold all these ups and downs. So I think I'll stop there, and thank you for your kind attention. And let's just sit quietly for a few moments, and I'll ring a bell to end.